Good morning. Today's daf is Ayin Vav 76. We are picking up on daf Ayin Vav, actually 2, 4, 6 lines down from the top. Yomi. So let's remember again, we had a statement on Amud Beis actually it was a statement on Ayin Hey Amud Aleph, that kusim are not permitted to marry to each other. Meaning, Rabbi Elazar said, "Kusi lo yisa kusis." Right, the kusi may not marry a kusis, and again, in general, this seems to go ahead and really build on the statement of the Mishnah, namely that again, in general, Jews are not permitted to marry kusim. So we're trying to figure out what's the problem with the kusim. So we had a variety of different opinions yesterday. Says the Gemara today, V'yesh, so others will say, I'll tell you why you can't marry a kusi. So this is 76a, 6 lines down from the top. So why can't you marry a kusi? Because ultimately the kusim are not meticulous enough, are not careful enough with the details of mitzvos. So we'll say, whose opinion is this reflected over here? Rabbi Eliezer. This is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. Why? Disanya matzas kusi muteres va'adam yotze v'yidei chavasu v'pesach. Supposed to listen to this. What happens if a kusi makes matzah? So what's the status of kusi matzah? So the Gemara says, Ravidi Bar Avin says, so the Tanakama says that matzah's kusi is muteres. So we'll say muteres means that it's not chametz. That's number one. And not only that, but you could actually go ahead and use the matzah of a kusi to fulfill your biblical obligation of matzah on the first night of Yom Tov. Now, if you take a look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says, Va'adam yotzei ba, b'leili Yom Tov arishon, sha'matzah chova. This is specifically referring to the first night of Yom Tov, where matzah is obligatory. V'yotzei ba d'lo havike kimchen b'tzeiko sha'ovdei kochavim. So he says, Shalo chamtzu, the kaimalon, Adam and Malik kreiso mehem, or bilat yochal kazayis matzah acharis bachrona. We should know matzah's mitzvah, but inon shimor l'shem mitzvah. So let's remember again, by matzah for the Leil HaSeder, by matzah for Pesach night, it's not simply enough that the matzah not be chametz. Thank you. It's not enough that the matzah not be chametz, but rather, again, it's also important that the matzah be made specifically for the purpose of the mitzvah. So the idea over here that the Gemara is saying is the matzah's kusi is not only kosher le Pesach, meaning not only is it not chametz, but what? It's also, we assume the kusi has the ability to go ahead and infuse the right kind of kavana as well, to make it usable for the first night of Pesach. Rabbi Eliezer also, Rabbi Eliezer says it's also, you can't use matzah's kusi. Why? The fishin became b'dikduke mitzvos, because kusim are not meticulous enough with the details. In other words, the idea over here is because kusim are not meticulous enough with the details, therefore again you cannot assume that their matzah A is kosher lePesach, and you certainly can't assume that lemaisa again it was made with the proper kavanah. So therefore the Gemara says, Kol mitzvah sheziku bakusim harbe medaktikim yosem Yisrael. This is actually very interesting. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, when it comes to kusim, here's the deal: anything they do with incredible kavanah, right? Anything they do, they pay attention to every single last detail. Not only that, by the way, the wording of Shimon Gamliel is very strong over here. He says, anything they do, so he says, medaktikim ba yoser mi Yisrael. Right? Anything kusim do, so if kusim are going to do it, they do with incredible, more intensity than even a regular Jew, so to speak. However, again, the corollary to that statement is that the stuff they don't do, they don't do. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, Ve'alahachi ma'im bekiyin. So okay, so I understand now, you want to tell me that the kusim are problematic because they're not medaktik, they're not careful with the details of mitzvos. How does that have a ramification over here by marriage? Right? Meaning, so what does that have to do with our discussion here? So the Gemara says, the fishin bekim b'toras Kiddushin and Kiddushin. The issue over here is what? Is that the kusim are not vigilant enough, or they're not really knowledgeable enough in the laws of Kiddushin and Kiddushin. I both say, what's the problem? If you're not knowledgeable enough in the laws of Kiddushin and Kiddushin, so what happens? You could easily end up trampling on some mamzerus issues. So because of that essentially what the Gemara is saying is there's a concern regarding mamzerus. Therefore, again, you can't marry a kusi. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman, and by the way, not only can you not marry a kusi, but as Rabbi Elazar said, kusim can't marry each other either. But Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, mamzer me'achos, mamzer me'eshesach, nisarvu mehen. So as Rav Nachman says, no, I'm going to tell you what the problem with kusim are. The problem with kusim is that there are mamzerim that were mixed in with kusi families. Specifically, again, if you have a mamzer, remember we spoke about this before. The chil between mamzer me'achos, mamzer me'eshes ach. So, for example, a person produces a child with his sister, an act of incest. So that child is a mamzer. Well, that's machlokes, but right now the Gemara suggests that's a mamzer. But remember, that relationship is punishable by kares, not by misas bezdin. As opposed to, let's say, a person's sister-in-law or another person's wife. Ultimately, again, these are relationships punishable by misas bezdin, and therefore they go ahead and produce mamzerim as well. So Rav Nachman says in Rabbi Baravua, the problem with kusim is that essentially mamzerim got mixed in. What types of mamzerim? Mamzer me'achoso, mamzer produced from a union with a sister, or mamzer from a sister-in-law. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malon yesh mamzer mechayve krisos." So first of all, it's such a strange wording. Why don't you just tell me that's what? Why don't you just tell me that you can't marry into the kusim? Why? Because lamaisa there's a concern of mamzerim. Right? I mean, why do you have to phrase it this way? So maybe you're going to phrase it this way because you want to teach me a lesson, and the lesson is that even a union with a sister could produce a mamzer, even though again it's quote unquote chayve krisus and not chayve misas bezdin. To which the Gemara says nisni chada. So just go ahead and therefore say that you can't marry into the kusim because what? Because there are mamzerim that were produced with sisters that are mixed in, and that teaches me two things. Teaches me, number one, that you can't marry into the kusim. Ultimately, why? Because of mamzeros issues. And number two, that you subscribe to the idea that even a relationship punishable by kares, not by misas bezdin, can produce mamzerim as well. But why the need to say, because there's mixed in with them, mamzerim that were produced from an illicit union with a sister, and mamzerim that were produced with an illicit union from a sister-in-law. Why the need to say both of those things? To which the Gemara says, Maise shahaya, kachaya. Because the Gemara says, no, we're not trying to teach you anything than what actually occurred. So apparently, again, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that literally this is what happened, that over time, these types of individuals were mixed into the ranks of the kusim. The Gemara is not trying to teach you any additional lessons. The Gemara is just simply trying to convey information. Ma'aseh shahaya, kachaya. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rava says the problem with kusim is what? Eved v'shivcha nisarvu bohen. That the problem is that Eved and Shivcha, slaves, avadim kinanim, right? Shivcha ivrios, kinanios, got mixed in with them, and therefore again you can't marry into the kusim. So the Gemara says isura mishum mai. So what's the isur? Mishum Shivcha nis nichadas. What's it? The Gemara asks the same thing. Why do you have to say that an Eved and Shivcha got mixed in? Why don't you just say that the problem is that slaves, shvachos, married into the kusim? Why do they need to say both of these things? To which the Gemara says again, Maisa shahaya kachaya. The Gemara is reflecting certain historical realities, that there were documented cases of a slave, or documented cases of a slave woman who ultimately married into the ranks of the kusim. So I will say, so bottom line, although we have many different opinions, 5 to be exact, different opinions, as to why the kusim can't go ahead and, number one, marry into Klal Yisrael, or why a Jew can't marry a Kusi, and furthermore, again, according to Rabbi Eliezer, why the Kusim can't marry each other. We have 5 different reasons, but again, bottom line, everyone agrees that indeed is the halacha. Says the Mishnah. So you understand, of course, a lot of these things, all of these things, aren't, you could find them codified in Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam, but of course they don't really apply today. And that's all, when I say all of these things, that's true with the status of an Egyptian convert because remember, at this point in time, we operate under the assumption that Sancheriv came along and mixed up all of meaning Sancheriv was a global ruler, a regional ruler. He mixed up all of the nations, meaning Sancheriv's strategy was that when he conquered a particular nation, he uprooted them and moved them to a different land so they wouldn't be on their indigenous land. He felt that prevented rebellion, which he was correct to a very large degree. So the idea is that, somebody from Egypt comes along today and says, I want to convert. So we don't judge that person as a Mitzri convert. We say, okay, you could convert, but the first 3 generations, we assume that just because people identify with certain lands right now, they're not necessarily indigenous to that particular land, and therefore a lot of these prohibitions won't apply. And so you'd be hard-pressed to find a card-carrying Kusi today, but should you find one again, the halacha. Says the Mishnah, Hanose Isha Kohana. So we'll say now an interesting case. A man is marrying a woman who is a Kohenes. So what happens? So the halacha is tzricha livdok. I will say this is talking about the only real a man married kohenes. So this a person tzricha livdok achara arba imos. So we'll say listen to this. So the Mishnah is not talking about that when you're a kohen and you're marrying someone. So really it doesn't love dafka, just has to be a kohen. But when you're marrying a kohenes, a person should go ahead and check into the family and check into up to 4 generations. Arba imos. Now we'll define exactly what this means and who these people are in just a moment. So shehein shmona. So ultimately, again, who become 8 people. Now, what does this mean? So we'll say here are the people. Ima, you have to check into the woman's mother. Ve'em ima, and ultimately the mother of her mother. Ve'em avi ima, and the mother of her father's mother. Ve'ima, and her mother as well. Ve'em aviha, and ultimately the mother of her father. Ve'ima, and her mother. Ve'em avi aviha, and the mother of her grandfather. Ve'ima, and ultimately her mother as well. So there are 4 primary mothers, but the idea is you're also going to check the mother of those mothers. So these are the people you have to check out before ultimately again agreeing to get married. Levia v'Yisraelis. So we'll say this is true for a kohenes, but for a Levia v'Yisraelis, right? So what happens? Mosifin aleihen od achas. So we'll say for a Levi Yisraelis, you have to go ahead and add on 1 more mother. And we'll say, so what does this mean? This is interesting. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Mosifin aleihen od achas. There's 1 additional mother added for each of the categories. So we'll say that what that effectively would say is, whereas for a kohenes you're checking out 8 mothers in total, for a Levia Yisraelis you're checking out a total of 12 mothers. So ultimately we'll say we're going to see why this is. We're going to see what, meaning one would have thought that we'll see why it is in the Gemara. So in both, but say, but here's what's interesting. There are certain people where if they act in certain capacities, they're acting in a particular capacity in and of itself is a seal of approval on their yichus. So for example, if a Kohen is doing the avoda on the Mizbeach, if he does the avoda, that tells us what? His yichus is perfect. And we're going to see why. Because in order to do many of these things, or hold some of these positions, you have to be vetted. You had a background check. So if a Kohen's doing the avodah on the Beis HaMikdash, that shows his background is fine. So he says, "In bokin similarly for a Levi, if a Levi would stand on the duchen, Abba said the duchen was the platform on which the Leviim would sing. If a Levi is a member of the Levitic choir, he has a spot on the duchen, then ultimately you need not do any additional genealogical investigation. Similarly, again, if somebody serves on the Sanhedrin, you need not do any additional investigation. But similarly, again, anyone who has in their family, so relatives who are Mishotrei Harabim, both say Shotrei Harabim will see, refers to other judges who are not on the Sanhedrin, but other judges. The Gabbai Tzedakah, this is amazing. So you know, say if a person has in their family, right? So my father is a Gabbai Tzedakah, that's enough of a stempel. That's a sila mayichos as well. So the halachas in all of these cases, if people occupy these positions, masin lekuna, you can marry them off to the kahuna. Ve'ein tzarech livdok acharein, and there is no need for any further investigation. Rabbi Yossi Omer af mishaya chasum eid ba'archei hayashana shal tzipori. So Rabbi Yossi says even someone who used to sign as a witness on documents in the court of Yeshana in Tzipori. So we'll say again, we'll see that in this court of Yeshana of Tzipori, they used to vet the witnesses very carefully. So if you were the kind of person that ultimately was able to go ahead and sign on documents there, that also indicates your genealogical fitness. The Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus Omer, Af Mishaya Muchtav Be'isratcha Shal Melech. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus said, so too again, if you were a soldier in the king's army, that's also indicative of genealogical fitness. It says the Gemara, Maishna benashi badkinanu maishna begavri lo badku. So we'll say, so they ask the Gemara the following. So remember, the Mishnah begins with a very simple statement, which is that if you want to marry a woman, what's the halacha? You need to check out her genealogy. How much genealogy do you have to check out? It depends. If she's a Kohenes, you have to do 4 mothers who are 8. And if she's a Levia Yisraelis, you have to check out 12. So asks the Gemara, that's nice. why is it that why is it that men are only checking out women and women aren't checking out men? In other words, why is there not a concept that ultimately a woman before she marries a man should check his mothers as well? To which the Gemara says, this is actually a very interesting answer. Nashi dechimenatsu bahadadi hadadi ba'arayosu deminsu. Them isa deika milsalo istekala. So Gemara says something very interesting. When women get into a fight and they want to challenge one another, they often call the other's virtue into question. Right? You're this, you're that, you're immoral, you're this. So that's how when apparently when women get really into a difficult fight, so that's ultimately how they impugn the other's integrity, by making comments about the virtue of the other. So therefore, again, if there was a genealogical issue, then Lamaisa, again, we would not necessarily know about it. As opposed to Gavri, Dichiminatsu Bahadadi, Bahadi Adadi, we'll say men, when they get into arguments, so how do they disparage each other? Biyuchsin hu diminatzi. What do they do? We'll say, you're a mamzer, you're a chalal, you're a shtuki, you're a kusi. So that's how men fight. So we'll say, so why is this helpful for us? Because generally, with men, if there is a genealogical issue, you'll know about it. In other words, listen, what the Gemara is saying is, people inevitably get into arguments at some point in time over the course of their life, and those arguments can get heated. So if there's some genealogical baggage, that's the mud that men will sling at each other. So if there is a genealogical issue or some hint to it, we'll know about it. By women, when they argue, they don't really argue about genealogy, but rather they argue about personal character or personal virtue, and therefore again, the Maisa, it may never come out. Therefore, again, this investigation is necessary. V'ihi nami tivdog bididei. So why? But why still? Why doesn't she go ahead? Why doesn't she go ahead and ultimately check out his mothers as well? In other words, why not go ahead? Look at Rashi. Ihi nami akohenes amaylo etzrichia livdok biachas baila dalarimos dilma ika milsa benashin shakta biyoksin. So we'll say, remember again, this is talking about the Kohenes. So the Kohenes is coming from a Kohanic family. So why isn't she obligated to check out his background in order to preserve her Kohanic familial integrity? To which the Gemara says, Misayeya le l'rav d'amrad hudamarav lo husuru kasheros linasi lepsulin. We learned this 2 days ago, because we passing like Rav, namely what? That although Kohanim are not permitted to marry certain people, those same prohibitions do not apply to Kohenes. They do not apply ultimately to a female. Therefore, again, there is no need for her to go ahead and really do an investigation into his yichus. So, Ravada bar Ava, Tani, Daladimo Shem Shteimisrei, B'mas Nisa Tana, Daladimo Shem Sheishisrei. So we'll say, so we have a problem. Because here Ravada bar Ava quotes another brisa, and in that brisa it says you have to check out 4 mothers who are really 12. And then Rabbi in another brisa it says you have to check out 4 mothers who are really 16. Now, both of these go ahead and pose problems ultimately to our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says you have to check out 4 mothers who are really 8. To which the Gemara says, Bishlama, the Ravada bar Ava. So according to Ravada bar Ava, this makes sense. Amud Beis, Mokim la, Belevio, Bas Yisrael. So we'll say, the 4 that are 12 is not a problem, because the truth is, our Mishnah spoke about those as well. That's the Levi and Yisraelis. Remember again, so the Kohenes needs 4 who are 8, 4 primary mothers, and add on their mothers. Ultimately, again, that's 8. The Levi Yisraelis require the 4 primary, plus their 4, plus add on another 4 that ultimately gives us 12. Ela Masnisa Nema Pliga. But ultimately, what about the second brisa that says that you require 16 mothers? Ultimately, again, as used to argue on the Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, Ela Masnisa Nema Pliga. Lo, my od achos. No, what does it mean ultimately again? Another mother. Zug achos. We'll say ultimately means another pair for each of the imos. In other words, it's possible when the Mishnah says that for Levi and Yisraelis you need another mother, means another pair of mothers. And therefore, again, that would give us a total of 16. But say the entire discussion reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. However, Chachamim will say, the Chachamim say, Kol mishpachos becheskas ksherosim omdos. So we'll say, this is a very important shita. The Chachamim say, we don't have to start getting into checking into mothers and 16 mothers and 25 mothers and 4 mothers and 8 mothers. Chachamim say a family has a cheskas kashrus unless, of course, what? You know to the contrary. In other words, that what Rabbi Meir and the Mishnah to a certain degree presupposes is that you don't have a cheskas kashrus meilav, meaning that cheskas kashrus has to be established through investigation. So it's just a shaila of how many mothers you have to investigate. The Chum say, not true. Every family has a cheskes kashrus. And therefore, by definition, there is no need to check anything out, unless, of course, you hear something that requires investigation. Ini is that so. V'hamarav Chana bar Goryo Amarav Mishnah Seinu Kishekori. I love Iror. But we'll say, yet we learned that Rav said that our Mishnah is actually talking about a case where what? Where Lemaisa, again, there was some level of objection about the family. Now, also what the Gemara now is suggesting is that Lemaisa, in the case of the Mishnah, is where there was Iror, is where somebody raised objections about the family. Now, by Pashtos, even the Chachamim would agree that if there is Iror, if somebody's raising genealogical objections about the family, then there is an obligation for investigation. And what would that investigation look like? So that's where the Mishnah comes in. The 4 mothers who are 8, or the 4 mothers ultimately who are 12. So the Gemara says, Man de masniha, lo masniha. So it could be that the one who mentioned this price is not the same author of the Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, Man de masniha, lo masniha. Look at Rashi. Man de masniha, mishmei drav, lo masniha. V'amorayninu, Rav Yehuda, Rav Chama, am liba drav. So we'll say, it could very well be that there's just simply a machlokes regarding what Rav himself held. Fine, Ibaisem, the other possibility is, Ikad Amri, Amrav Yehuda Amrav, Zudiv Rabbi Meir. These words are Rabbi Meir. V'cham Omrim, Kol Mishpachos Becheskes Kashosem Omdos. So we'll say in this version you have Rav saying that these are the words of Rabbi Meir, the Mishnah, meaning that you require investigation. However, again, there's also the position of the Chacham. The Chacham hold every family has a Cheskes Kashos. Amarav Chanabar Gurya Amarav. However, Im Kore Alav Iror Tzarech Livdok Achares. We'll say in this second version it's more explicit. In this second version, the halacha says the following: every family has a cheskes kashrus. Every family has a presumption of being genealogically fit. In the event that objections or issues are raised, then what? Then there is an obligation to investigate. And what does that investigation look like? So for a Kohenes, it's 4 mothers who are 8, and for a Levi Yisraelis, it's 4 mothers who are 12. Says the Gemara in Bokim in Azayach Lamalos. Remember again, the Mishnah said, however, if a Kohen is serving, if he's doing the avodah, he's working on the mizbeach, that is enough of a stempel on his genealogy, and he doesn't require any additional investigation. So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Ilav debat kua lo have maskin. I both say we don't let any Kohen get up and do the avodah until what? Until he's genealogically vetted. So if he's doing that avodah, that means he's vetted, and therefore no additional investigation into his yichus is required. Similarly, again, if a Levi is singing from the platform, is singing from the duchen, ultimately, again, he does not require any further investigation. My time, what's the reason? The Amar Mar Shesham Hayu Yoshim Yachseku This is actually amazing that here the Gemara says that literally there were a group of people, probably members of the Sanhedrin, who were tasked with, they were like the genealogy investigative unit. You know, their job was to vet all of the Kohanim and Leviim. Therefore, again, essentially the Gemara is saying is if anybody is acting in a Kohanic capacity or Levitic capacity in the Beis HaMikdash, that by definition means they've been vetted and therefore they're genealogically fit. So the Gemara goes right there. Similarly, again, you can't, if you're sitting on the Sanhedrin, there is no need for any additional genealogical investigation. So my time, what's the reason for this? The Tani Rav Yosef, because Rav Yosef said, "Kashem shebeis din menukin b'tzedek, kach menukin mikol mum." So also Rav Yosef said that the same way that a beis din menukin b'tzedek Rav means that they're virtuous. They're virtuous people, meaning you can't go ahead and be a judge in the Sanhedrin if you're not a virtuous person. Meaning again, if you're not a righteous individual, kach menukin mikol mum. So the members of the Sanhedrin are also cleared or also freed from any genealogical blemishes. Menukin mikol mum. Amar Mereimar, Maikra, what's the pasuk that supports this idea? Kulach yafe rayasi, umum ein bach. The pasuk says in Shir Hashirim, you are totally beautiful, my beloved, umum ein bach, and there is no blemish in you. So the Gemara's understanding over here that the rayasi, the beautiful ones, refers to the members of the Sanhedrin, and mum ein bach refers to genealogical blemishes. They're genealogically fit. Says the Gemara, well, one second, Ema Muma Mamish. Maybe Mum Ein Ba literally means that what? That the members of the Sanhedrin can't have any physical blemishes. How do you know that's referring to genealogical blemishes? Maybe it's referring to physical blemishes. Amar Rav Achar Yaakov Amar Kra, V'hisyatzvu Sham Imach. The pasuk says, Rabbi said, this is talking about Moshe Rabbeinu gathered 70 elders to help him with Klal Yisrael. So the pasuk says, Moshe, they will stand with you. V'hisyatzvu Sham Imach, with you. What does it mean with you? Imach B'domim Lacha, with those who are like you. Now, in what ways do the other judges have to be like Moshe Rabbeinu? So the Gemara is suggesting over here that they're like Moshe Rabbeinu in terms of the fact that they're genealogically fit. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu was miyuchas, he was genealogically fit, so too to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you have to be genealogically fit as well. The Dilma Mishum Shechina, maybe that was different. Maybe the difference over there is that those individuals had to be genealogically fit. In other words, the Sanhedrin of Moshe Rabbeinu's generation had to be genealogically fit. Why? Because they were given nevuah. They were given prophecy. So that's the reason ultimately they have to be genealogical. But maybe it doesn't apply to future generations. Amar Nachman Amar Kra va'kel me'alecha v'nasu itcha. The pasuk says ultimately again the people, the Sanhedrin, will lessen the burden from on top of you. V'nasu itcha, but they will bear the burden together with you. So itcha B'domim Lacha teaches us that what? That the members of the Sanhedrin must be like Moshe Rabbeinu. And just like Moshe Rabbeinu was genealogically fit, so too the members of the Sanhedrin must be genealogically fit as well. So the next case, let's remember, anyone whose ancestors were of the Shotrei Harabim. Shotrei Harabim refers to judges, but not necessarily judges of the Sanhedrin. General judges. So the Gemara says, Shotrei Harabim, Rashi says, Dayonin Ba'alma, She'inam Memanin Esrim V'shalosh Shal Sanhedrin Ketana. So we'll say, so again, this is not the members of the high court, but rather members of secondary courts. So the Gemara says, why is this? The Memra, so if a person is a member of a secondary court, the halach is that's a statement of genealogical fitness. Why the Memra? We'll say, because what do we see from here? We don't appoint judges from people who are genealogically blemished. Or minhu, is that true? Hakol ksherim ladun dinei mamonus, ve'inakol ksherim ladun dinei nefashos. So we'll say, we learned everyone is fit to adjudicate monetary cases, but not everyone is fit to adjudicate capital cases. V'havinan ban, we asked about this. Hakol asun, what does it mean when you say everyone? What does everyone mean? From Rabbi Yehuda, la'asui mamzer. The Rabbi say even a mamzer could be a dayon. Even a mamzer could go ahead and be a judge to adjudicate a case. Rabbi say now you'll say to yourself, of course you can. What's the Kiddushin? That meaning being a mamzer just impacts your ability to marry. Why should it impact your ability to do anything else? We'll see why in just a little bit. But nevertheless, the Gemara suggests over here that for dinei mamonis, for monetary issues, so even the mamzer is permitted to go ahead and adjudicate the case. Amar Abaye b'Yerushalayim. We'll say, so Abaye says, we're talking about in Yerushalayim. So we'll say, so now remember, if a mamzer is fit to be a judge, then what? Then the Mishnah statement is problematic. Because what did the Mishnah say? If somebody's a judge, that indicates that what? That their yichos is in order. But one second, if we just got finished saying that even a mamzer could be a judge, then being a judge in a secondary court is not enough to go ahead and solidify your genealogical fitness. So by what are we talking about? Shebi Yerushalayim. We're talking about judges in Yerushalayim. Rashi points out something amazing. Yerushalayim, hayu makpidin al kol dayaneim liyachsan. So we'll say apparently in Yerushalayim there was a particular insistence that all judges must be genealogically fit. Even though me'ikra din, according to the letter of the law, at least in monetary cases, you could have a judge ultimately who was a mamzer. In Yerushalayim they were makpid that judges should be genealogically fit. So therefore, again, if you're a judge in Yerushalayim, that indicates your genealogical fitness. So says the Gemara, V'chein Tani Rabbi Shimon bar Zida, B'kiddushay de Beit Levi b'Yerushalayim. Ultimately, again, what are we talking about over here? So the Gemara says, let's say that differently. Tani Rabbi Shimon bar Zera, Kiddushin de Bei Levi. So Rabbi Shimon bar Zera used to pass about that Kiddushin de Bei Levi means the laws of Kiddushin as expressed in the yeshiva of Levi, B'Yerushalayim. Ultimately, again, the Mishnah statement that if someone is a judge, that indicates genealogical fitness, is that we're talking about if they were a judge on a secondary court in Yerushalayim. Because in Yerushalayim they were makbid, that only genealogically fit men should be dayanim. But outside of Yerushalayim, having a seat on a Beis Din does not automatically solidify your genealogical fitness. The Gabbai Tzedakah Masim. But another interesting case. So remember the Mishnah said if somebody's a Gabbai Tzedakah, right? Gabbai Tzedakah means the person who was responsible for dispersing, collecting and dispersing communal tzedakah. So if a guy is a Gabbai Tzedakah, then you know that he's genealogically fit. Says the Gemara, my timer. What's the reason for that? So Kevan de Minsu Bahadi Inshi, because we'll say what happens. Gabbai Tzedakahs get into fights with people all of the time. They'll say, now this is interesting. Why do they get into fights with people? The Amar Mar Memashkinim ala Tzedakah va'afilu b'erev Shabbos. So we'll say the halacha is if a person makes a pledge to tzedakah, the halacha is that one is supposed to honor that pledge as quickly as possible. Lo sa'achel shalamo. Person should honor the pledge as quickly as possible. So what happens with the Gabbai Tzedakah? Sometimes the Gabbai Tzedakah needs the money. So what does he do? He shows up at someone's house on Erev Shabbos. Now, no one likes last-minute company on Erev Shabbos. A little bit of a hectic time. And what does the Gabbai Tzedakah do? The Gabbai Tzedakah has the right to seize collateral if people aren't paying their debts. Can you imagine? So we'll say these are Kehila debts. So a person not paying his Kehila debts, so the Gabbai Tzedakah comes, so we'll say, so what happens? Can you imagine the scene? It's an hour before Shabbos, the Gabbai Tzedakah goes and knocks on the door, I'm here to collect your pledge, and I say to him, what? Really? Do we have to do this now? Right? I'm saying, can we just talk on Sunday? Matzei Shabbos, need to do this now. And what does he say? Yes. And not only that, but he goes ahead and he takes my watch. He takes my watch. I'll just hold on to this until you pay your pledge. So says the Gemara, what happens? Vim Isa diika. If the Gabbai Tzedakah had any genealogical flaws, guess what? Isle kala. You know what? It would come out. When would it come out? Say on Friday afternoon, as the Gabbai Tzedakah is taking my watch for collateral for my pledge. In other words, this goes back to what we said before, which is that when men get into arguments, generally the way they disparage each other is through highlighting genealogical deficiencies. The Gabbai Tzedakah is someone who inevitably is going to argue and get into fights with people. That is going to happen. Therefore, again, I will say, if it turns out that he does have genealogical deficiencies, those would come out. If they're not out, it means what? It means they don't exist. Therefore, the Maisa, the Gabbai Tzedakah has a presumed cheskas kashrus. Ushbezichne de Rav Ada bar Abba ki yurahava. So we'll say the landlord of Rav Ada bar Abba. And Rav Ada bar Abba was a renter, so the place where he lived, his landlord was a ger, was a convert. Mansi ihi v'Rav Bibi. And we'll say what happened. The landlord, who apparently was a strong and influential, wealthy individual, would constantly argue with Rav Bibi. And we'll say, what were they arguing about? Mar Amar ana avidna sirarusa demasa. So one of them said, I'm going to be in charge of the matters of the city. Umar Amar ana avidna sirarusa demasa. And the other guy said, no, I'm going to be in charge of the business of the city. So we'll say, here, Rav Bibi and the ger landlord are getting into an argument who is going to run the affairs of the city. They came before Rav Yosef to go ahead and settle this matter. Who's going to run the city? Amar lahu Tanina. So Rav Yosef said to him, listen, there is a teaching, Som tasim alecha melech mikarav achecha. We'll say, if you're going to appoint for yourself a king, your king must come from within the midst of your brethren. And I will say, now we know is, for example, a ger, a convert, cannot become a king, cannot become a melech. So that's for two reasons. Number one, because obviously a ger can't be part of Shevet Yehuda. Right? In order to be can't be part of Shevet Yehuda. And also, Mikarav Achecha, the Gemara understands, means that what? That the king has to be someone who is born Jewish. Mikarav, from the midst of your brethren, cannot become someone who joins the fold of Judaism at some time later on. So the Gemara extrapolates from this, we'll say it's not just by king, but for any major leadership positions, a leader, someone appointed to leadership positions within the Jewish people, major positions, must come must come from the midst of your brethren, which by definition would exclude the convert. Amrli Rav Ada bar Ava Bafilu Yomi Yisrael. I will say, so as Rav Ada bar Ava said to him, but 1 second, would this include someone whose father was a convert, but whose mother was Jewish? So Amrli, no, what are you talking about? When we speak about both sides that a person is excluded under the Mikara B'Chacha clause, that refers to someone himself who converted. But if someone has a Jewish mother, Rabosai, whether his father was a convert or even if his father was a Gentile, what's the halacha? That child is a full-fledged Jew from birth and satisfies the criteria of Mikara B'Chacha. Hilchach. Therefore, again, Rav Yosef made the following pshara: Rav Bibi de Gavar Rabahu le'ayin b'mili d'shmaya. So Rav Bibi, so we'll say, so it appears from this exchange, by the way, that the landlord, although the Gemara is calling him a ger, what the Gemara really means is that he was the son of a ger. His father was a ger. So therefore, again, now Rabbi Yosef said, well, if his father was a ger and his mother was Jewish, then he's a Jew from birth, and therefore, by definition, he satisfies the Mikerev Achacha criteria. Therefore, Rabbi Yosef says, I want to suggest the following pshara: Hilchach Rav Bibi Digaver Rabba Hava Le'ayin B'milu D'Shmaya. Rav Bibi, you're a great man. You take responsibility for the spiritual matters of the city, right? You're responsible for the ruchnius of the city, which means you're going to be in charge of the shuls, you're going to be in charge of the batei din, and you're going to be in charge of chesed and stucco. You take care of the religious matters of the city. Umar, and you, other guy, we'll call him again, landlord, b'mili demasa. You go ahead and take care of the physical needs of the city. The mundane physical things, those are your responsibilities. Says the Gemara, Amra Abaye, Hilchach, man de mashri tzur mirabanan. Hilchach man de mashri tzur mirabanan v'ish bezichnei le'ashrei kirav ada bar ava diyadul mehapech bezichusei. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, if you're going to have someone live by you who is a Talmud Chacham, try to find someone like Rav Ada bar Ava who will always find your merits. In other words, Rav says, so Rav Ada bar Ava ultimately, again, trying to find his way to negotiate this situation. Fine. So Rabbi Zera mitaba b'hu. So Rav says, now the Gemara just discusses, now we introduce an interesting topic, which is what? The role of a ger in leadership positions. What leadership positions can you appoint a convert to, and what can't you? Now remember, when we're speaking about a convert, now we've also defined our terms. Convert does not refer to a child of Gerim, because remember, we'll say, now this is interesting because we spoke about this yesterday, that a child of Gerim does have certain Ger-like qualities or Ger-like status, but yet in this type of situation where there's where in order to go and appoint someone as a leader, he must come mikarav from the midst of your brethren, so that if somebody is born to a Jewish mother, Lemais, again, he satisfies the mikarav. Now the Gemara is going to discuss, so let's talk about Gerim in leadership positions. So says the Gemara, I'm sorry. Rabbi Zera metapabahu. Rabbi Zera would go. Rashi says metapabahu means misasik bam lechabdon loshim misrara. Rabbi Zera used to appoint converts to positions of leadership. Right? He would involve himself with them. He would appoint them to positions of leadership. Rabbi Barabu, a metapabahu. Similarly, Rabbi Barabu also appointed Gerim to positions of leadership. The Ma'arava in Eretz Yisrael, afilu reish kuri lo mukmi. We'll say they would not even appoint a ger to be the reish kuri. We'll say reish kuri means the person in charge of the department of weights and measures. In other words, so again, it's a leadership. It's not exactly the most important leadership position, but it's in a leadership. In Eretz Yisrael, they were makbid that they would not appoint gerim to any positions of leadership. So the Gemara says, in a narda, they wouldn't even appoint the gerim to be the heads of the irrigation department. So we'll say, remember again, what the Gemara is pointing out is the following. Here's what everybody agrees with. Everyone agrees to the fact that, let's say, to be king, so a ger can't be a king because the king must come mikarav achecha. We also understand that to some degree, that prohibition of appointing a ger to a leadership position does apply to other positions other than the monarchy. The shaila is how to define the scope of that prohibition. So some say it will apply to every single position of leadership, big or small. That seems to be the approach in Eretz Yisrael Narda. Yet in other places, it seems to be that it was only reserved for monarchical type positions. But other communal leadership positions, again, you see these other rabbanim that were quite confident and comfortable in appointing gerim ultimately to serve in those positions. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Yossi Omer Af Mishahaya. So the Gemara says, remember that Rabbi Yossi says even one who used to sign on documents. The lashon over here was someone who used to sign on documents in the court of Yeshana of Tzipori. So the Gemara says, so this also attested to a person's lineage. Why is that? My taima. In this particular Beis Din, they would not let people sign without first vetting their lineage. Only if you vetted their lineage, ultimately, then would you have the ability to sign. Therefore, if they're signing on documents in this Beis Din, therefore, halacha l'maisa, again, they would be fine. Rabbi Yossi Omer Af Mishahaya. I'm sorry. Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus Omer. Suppose Rabbi Chanina ben Antigonus said that if you served in the army of the king, that was also indicative of a genealogical fitness. So says the Gemara. This refers dafka to the soldiers in David HaMelech's army. David HaMelech was apparently very medaktek. Rabbi Yosef Mikra. What's the pasuk that supports this idea? So the pasuk says over here, V'hisyachashtam, or I should say, V'hisyachsam, Batzava b'milchama. So ultimately, David HaMelech would only use soldiers with proper pedigree and yichus. The time Amai, what's the reason for that? Amrad Yehuda Amarav, Kadeshate Zechusan Uzechusavosa Messiah. Because also remember, when you're going out to battle, you want every competitive edge, and therefore again, David HaMelech only used soldiers for a proper yichus. This way, what? They would have their own personal zechuyos, and also zechusavos, also the merits of their forefathers. Therefore again, the Maisa, the Mishnah says, that if you were a soldier in David HaMelech's army, that was also enough of a seal of approval on your yichus. Tzelek ha'amoni. But what about Shabbos? One of the soldiers identified as a prominent soldier in David HaMelech's army was a guy by the name of Tzelek ha'amoni. So presumably again, I will say he's a Gentile. My lad da'asi me'amon. Are we not saying that he came from? Meaning, did he not come from Ammon? He's a Gentile. Lo diyasev va'amon. No, I will say he was Jewish, but he just happened to live in Ammon. Va'ika Uriah Chiti. What about Uriah Chiti? So again, calling someone a Chiti sounds like he's a non-Jew as well. My love, the Asi Miches. Is it not that he comes from the city of Ches and he's not Jewish? Lo, the Yosef Beches. No, it means he was just living there. Vaha'ika Itai Hagiti. But I will say, what about this other individual by the name of Itai from Gat? I will say, now understand that Gat was a Philistine stronghold. So is he not? He must have been not Jewish. So maybe you'll say, no. He was Jewish, but he lived in Gat. V'amrav Nachman Ita Hagiti ba ubitla. We'll say that can't be, and I'll tell you why. Because Ita Hagiti, we'll say David HaMelech had captured from one of the monarchies that he conquered. He had captured a beautiful crown, and that crown had a stone in it. That stone was worshipped as idolatry, and Ita Hagiti was the one who negated the idolatry. Then we'll say that very quickly. In order to go ahead and negate idolatry requires a Gentile. Jews cannot go ahead and negate idolatry. Only Gentiles can. So Itai Hagiti had to come along and negate the idolatrous identity of the stone in order for David HaMelech to be able to use it in his crown. Which shows us what? That Itai Hagiti ultimately again was a Gentile of Od. Amrav Yehuda Amarav. Arba Meos Yiladim Hayil David. David HaMelech had 400 children. The Kulan Bnei Yefastar Hayu, and they were all the children of war brides. I'm both saying, now this doesn't literally mean that David HaMelech, it means David HaMelech and his soldiers fathered 400 children from these war brides. The Kulan Mistaprim Kumi Umegadlim Beloris. All of them, both say, had a Gentile haircut. The Gentile haircut was their hair was cut short in the front, and they had a beloris. Beloris is like a ponytail in the back. The kulam yoshim mikranio shalzav. They all sat in golden chariots. Vayimahalchim b'rashe gaisos, and they would go out in the front of the army. The hein baale egrofim shabbeis David, and ultimately these were the most valiant soldiers of the base David. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You said David HaMelech had Gentile soldiers in his army. He had Gentile soldiers. So how can you say that serving in the army of David HaMelech is a seal of approval on your yichus when it's clear that he had Gentile soldiers? To which the Gemara says, no. The Azli Levause Alma. Those soldiers of Osai went out in front actually did not fight. They were there to create a fear factor. As I will say, when the other Gentile nations saw that David HaMelech had Gentile soldiers in his army, so the message that sent was, David HaMelech is a conqueror. And he has conquered other nations as well. And look, he even has their soldiers fighting for him. When the other armies saw this put fear into their hearts that they would be conquered as well. But those soldiers who went out in front were in fact not the real soldiers of David HaMelech's army. They were just the front line to inspire fear in the enemies. But the actual soldiers who fought, David HaMelech would only use not only Jewish soldiers, but ultimately soldiers who had yichus as well, in order that they could come to battle not only with their own merits, but with schus avos, the merits of their forefathers. And therefore, says the Mishnah, if you served in the army of David HaMelech, that was a testament and a sign to your genealogical fitness. We'll stop over here.